So over the next 30 minutes, 40 minutes or so, we'll traverse some features of Yemen and what it means for Australia. But just to kick off, I'd like to say that I spent 14 months in the country. I left Australia in January 2009 from a temporary position advising Senator Helen Coonan on foreign policy matters. When I left Canberra, I switched an Australian light off, and when I went to Yemen, I switched an Arab light on. And I had very little to do with the diplomatic corps, as I felt I'd already done enough in the diplomatic environment being a Canberra official. I spent my time mixing with Yemenis of all kinds, from ministers through to tribesmen, and I should say the people-to-people connection you can get like that away from the nitty-gritty of running an aid project is very fulfilling. And it's on the basis of those contacts, plus an analysis of the circumstance, that I can speak today to you about Yemen. I want to just quickly start by saying, why is Yemen important to Australia? I mentioned it's on a geostrategic fulcrum, and that runs now from Pakistan to Kenya, and we'll have seen the Horn of Africa again raise its difficult head over the weekend in Kampala with the murder of 74 football fans through a radical Islamic attack by the Shabab movement based in Somalia. Yemen sits across an important trade route for Australia. 7% of our exports and imports come past the Bab el-Mandeb at the mouth of the Red Sea. 25,000 ships traverse that same area. Whether we like it or not, what happens in those oceans is of importance, and we read about that regularly in the paper. Australia is concerned about global terrorism, and unfortunately the animation of some violent terroristic acts continues to come from Yemen or people who have been associated with it. As Anthony said, Yemen retains great cachet on the basis of its Islamic history within Southeast Asia amongst Muslim circles. The Malaysians, Singaporeans, Indonesians and others are spending far more time looking at Yemen and its influence over their countries than they were previously. Somalia and Yemen are linked through Islamic militancy, and this is reinforced by the consanguinity of Yemen and Somalia. One might think Somalia is in Africa and Yemen is in the Arab Middle East, but there's a greater connection culturally, linguistically, behaviourally, if you like, between Yemen and Somalia than there is between Yemen and Tunisia, Yemen and Algeria, Yemen and Syria. And it's the same can be said about Yemen and Ethiopia as well. Australia is a good international citizen and has regularly said this. The decay of a state in a geostrategic position deserves our attention, even if it is in a small way, and I'll raise a number of points we can think about in doing that in a minute. The question of dealing with Yemen, however, for diplomats and foreign policy observers in the audience also helps us enhance our relationships with, if you like, bigger and more important countries in the area like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman and others, because they themselves have an intense interest in what's going on in Yemen. If we do, we can develop closer working relationships, particularly in security circles, through a shared interest in Yemen than we could dealing just on bilateral matters with those countries, many of which outside the UAE have been quite difficult to cultivate as intelligence or security allies. Yemeni statistics that were issued in April this year tells us that, believe it or not, and I don't believe it, and therefore I can say it, 2,600 Australians visited Yemen the year before. And I just can't imagine who those people are or where they were from, because I kept a lookout for foreigners when I was living in Sana'a for 14 months, and to see a foreigner on the street was a notable event. I could probably count up to 12 Australians at a stretch, but 2,600 entries is something completely different. I also wanted just to kick off by saying that Australia can make a number of interventions in the area. And running through these, then I'll go on to describe the circumstances with Yemen. The state in Yemen is the way we will deal with the country. The time's long gone when, as in the colonial period, you could have policy and political officers look after a set of villages, whether it was in New Guinea, Iraq, Jordan, or, as the British did in then southern Yemen, in Yemen. Diplomacy gets done through state-to-state relationships, and what we think of states is one thing and how we deal with them is quite another, as we know. Australia should therefore tweak the strength of the central state in Yemen, weak as it is, but tweak it by establishing an honorary consulate in Sana'a to give us a little bit more profile and leverage in the area, and that would have been a most helpful thing to have had during the Shiloh Giddens affair, which you might recall when an Australian woman from Sydney was held in prison for 7 to 10 days about a month or so ago. The Australian Embassy, the Australian Embassy in Riyadh does not have the funds for regular visits to Yemen. The Canadians go once a month. The Embassy in Riyadh is far too underfunded to have any sensible appreciation of affairs in Yemen at present. Unfortunately, the government depends on the good offices of friendly Australians in the environment for introductions and support. I can say that because I was happy to do that, but if you want to run diplomacy, you have to pay for it. And taking advantage of today to say the government needs to pay for it. If social and economic development are important in terms of taking young people away from joblessness, perhaps offering them another 6 months at school, giving youth something to do, if social and economic development and trade are important, then it's a small thing for Austrade to appoint a local representative in Yemen, so they don't have to pay unless some services are done. But it's again a small sign of an Australian sensitivity to the circumstances there. We used to offer a lot of scholarships to Yemen, and some of those should come back online as well. And we have been famous in the past as a country for exporting agricultural expertise, and we can do the same again to a country like Yemen, where half the workforce is involved in agriculture, impoverished, arid and underdeveloped as it is. And that would be a good step in stabilising the country also. And if we can't do that ourselves, we should do that through multilateral organisations involved in agricultural development, like the Food and Agriculture Organisation or the International Fund for Agricultural Development. There are lots of channels available to the Commonwealth to think about these things. And we have the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, which has an Africa program that is dealing with Ethiopia, but can easily now arguably be extended to Somalia and across the Red Sea into Yemen. AusAid is opening an office in Addis Ababa shortly, and it should be used as a point of leverage to look at Somalia and Yemen from there as well. Australia, by the way, really only started giving a little bit of aid money to Yemen last year after a hiatus since 1991, I think, when Australia stopped helping Yemen on the basis of Yemen's position in the Security Council, abstaining on a vote related to a coalition invasion of Iraq after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, or the ejection of Iraqis from Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. The other area of interest is, and I should speak my own book on this one, the then Rudd government initiated an Australian Civilian Corps. The capacity of the Australian Civilian Corps is growing over time, or should grow over time. There are 25 people involved in it at present, and they provide resources for targeted aid and development advice into difficult national interest areas without worrying about a 5-year program worrying about large contracts. They're all under the command and control of the government on deployment, and that's a tool of government in dealing with countries like Yemen in the future. I've urged the Australian Ambassador for Counter-Terrorism, Bill Patterson, to make a trip to Yemen personally, because I feel that's the most important thing, is to have face-to-face contact with his counterparts there in case a major incident happens and Australia needs to mobilise at all levels rather than just at operational level in intelligence terms. The Foreign Minister told me last night that he had approved Bill Patterson to go, and hopefully now it's just a matter of time for him to start that liaison, which, as you might know from observing other countries, when it's done personally rather than bureaucratically, it has a much better impact and legacy. While I was in Yemen, I found some time as I worked with the Ministry of Interior, and to tell you the truth, they're the people that deal with counter-terrorism, although that was not my brief. This question of counter-terrorism support is the thing which exercises the minds of Western capitals far more, really, than social and economic development. That's a proxy tool for suppressing terrorism. But our Office of National Assessments, I believe, should have a Yemen and Somali cell established in it to focus analysis on the Horn of Africa and its circumstances, rather than having those issues washed through its Middle East and Africa area. And also I think that would stand us in good stead in our liaison with the United States and Britain if we could demonstrate that one person or two people had a focus on that area. And further, in terms of counter-terrorism, because that's what is on people's minds, Australia has a whole, as a white paper said, which mentioned Yemen and Somalia in it, the white paper on counter-terrorism earlier this year. I think we have to see if we can think about overcoming Yemen's silo mentality between its multiplicity of security agencies. We do that quite well. We've made some good headway in Australia doing that. And some of the lessons that we have and the Americans have, we can all do together in Yemen. And that's not putting people on the ground. It's some intellectual advice and support, organisational design, and perhaps a little bit of training. It's not an expensive investment, but it may be one which has some effect. Now, having said that, there'll be some in the audience who know intimately where Yemen is, and there'll be others who need a quick reminder. Australia's in yellow and Yemen's smaller and in the same colour. That's a close-up, and you'll see there why Yemen and Somalia are the sort of the parrot's beak, if you like, of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the top corner of the Indian Ocean. The borders of Yemen have been unsettled for some time. Yemen's a new state. It really didn't exist as a modern state until about 1960. And then in the north, the decolonialisation process, or the withdrawal of the British, was undertaken in the south, and merger of the two countries in 1990, and then a violent but short civil war in 1994 sealed the country's control and domination by the northern tribes of the country. The thing about Yemen is, as well, it has some gas, which it's undersold in price terms on the international market. It has some oil, and it's running out, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's of great interest to China. China has an enormous presence there, flying from Sana'a, anywhere in Yemen, except for the short trip to the industrial town of Taiz in the mountains. Nearly everybody else on the plane will mostly be either, of course, Yemeni or Chinese. And if you're in the eastern part of the country, nearly everybody you see on an aircraft will be Chinese. The Chinese presence in the country has been there for 25 years. The Russian presence has been in the country for about that period as well. You'll recall that the Chinese have been busy building a strategic port in Pakistan, at Gwadar, at the hydrocarbon export location for Pakistan. The Russians have indicated an interest in rehabilitating the port of Aden. The French have indicated an interest in developing one of the islands sitting right between that southeast to southwest corner of Yemen and Djibouti, and the Americans have a substantial presence in the country in kinetic military terms, as well as in intelligence support and aid. Really, the sense is now in Yemen and that area, the great game previously is on again now, with the powers of China looking for strategy, Russia seeking to reclaim a position in this chokehold area, the Americans, French and British doing the same from their own perspective. Talking of the seaboard area, no doubt Greek, Thai, Spanish and other fishing vessels are doing the same to the maritime resources of Yemen as they did in Somalia, an argument of which is that the despoilation of Somalia's fish resources has forced some of its littoral people into piracy. The Yemeni littoral communities are poor. Fishing is a handicraft industry, not as we would think of it at all. And the smuggling regime of weapons, people and diesel is enormous between Somalia and Yemen. Already the country is starting to fray around the seaboard edge, and I think that's probably why the Australian government, if there's any type of support in military terms, will be directed at the Yemeni Coast Guard or the Yemeni Navy. Now, Yemen's got about 23 million people, about the same size of population of Australia, roughly. It's about 65% the size of New South Wales, and whereas in New South Wales about 90% of people live in metropolitan areas and 65% live in this town, in Yemen 25% of people live in urban areas, and the rest are distributed through small villages, many of which still don't have electricity, no paved road access for many villages. They're isolated in terms of education, telecommunications and physical access. So the country is extremely difficult to govern centrally. And therefore, today we still see the embedded, entrenched, traditional, and not bad, authority and power of family, clan and tribe. And we'll come to make a comment about that also in a minute. So it's got the trappings of a state, but really it's tribally run, Yemen. And your affiliations as a Yemeni will be based on the geography of your origin, your family, the notations of your language, that's your vocabulary, the way you speak, because Yemenis would tell me that I just can't understand this man we're talking to. He comes from somewhere that's too far away from any known place, and I can't understand his language. The people who live in Sana'a will say, this is an old Sana'a family talking to you because of the way they speak. This is a new Sana'a family talking to you, and there's migrants into the capital city. And also your religion will provide an identifier to you, although the Yemenis have always been rather tolerant of religion internally, and still are, despite some bad-mouthing going on between the Sunni people and their Shia brethren, as a result of this sixth civil war, or this sixth insurrection in the north, which concluded trickled out in about February, March this year after 7 months of fighting. And during that time, jets and the military were on the move every day out of Sana'a. Yemen's got a class system as well. About 5% of the population claim a bloodline to the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter. They're called Sada, and they traditionally hold the jobs of Islamic judge, civil judge, the guides, if you like, of the spirituality and morality of an area. The next large group of people will be called Tribesmen, and they adhere to particular codes of conduct, dignity and honour, and they're quite immutable in terms of how you're meant to live up to what's expected of you, depending on where you sit in its own little hierarchy of tribes. Tribes can also be sedentary agriculturalists as well. And below those are the Muzayan, the people who cut hair, sell groceries, shopkeepers, what we call in Australia the backbone of small business. And when I bought some musical instruments, and I said, without understanding the ramifications of this, to the staff I had on the aid project, now I'm of the Muzayan, because I bought these pipes, they said, oh no, well, we can't work for you anymore. We'd only work for a tribesman. We can't work for a shopkeeper or a lower class individual as you've cast yourself. So I put the pipes back in the drawer and said I wasn't Muzayan, and I'm glad I got away with it. They have their own class of untouchables in Yemen as well. They may be mixed Arab-Ethiopian descent from the time when Ethiopia ran Yemen in about the 9th century. They're dark-skinned, quite black. They'll live in isolated camps on the edge of towns. They're not given any work of substance, not allowed to marry outside their group, and denied all of the rights, except that they're written on paper that they're not denied, but they don't have access to the same social services if there were to be. They don't have the same access to the wherewithal of existence in Yemen as their other citizen counterparts have. That's a very difficult circumstance, and it perplexes Yemenis to talk about it, but we have a four-class community, if you like, when we're dealing with them. Yemen also suffers from a very burdensome population of refugees, and I say burdensome because it does cost them money in management terms. About 700,000 Somalis live there. 600,000 or so are registered with the UNHCR. There might be 250,000 Ethiopian workers, and others come across daily illegally. There's around 65,000 small boat movements every year across the water between Somalia and Yemen. And that's where the traffic of people goes on. That's where the traffic of weapons, traffic of diesel occurs as well. And now the problems in Somalia, the linkage between the Shabab Islamist movement in Somalia with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, this relationship announced in January last year, has led the Yemeni security services to observe much more intently the Somali refugee community, and they've asked the Yemeni citizenry to report on the Somalis and their behaviour. And the UNHCR has complained about what this will mean for intracommunal relations in Yemen. So that country itself now is suffering from some internal tension, largely as a result of Western pressure and particularly Saudi pressure to exterminate Al-Qaeda presence in Yemen. Shabab, Al-Qaeda, and so on, and it leads us now to pressure on some pretty impoverished people who've fled terrible circumstances in Somalia. The tribal environment in Yemen is very, very important. The government is run by a cluster of families from the north, from the Hashid Confederation of Tribes. They have converted, in one sense, the structure of a state into a private economy to a large degree, where the assets and resources of the country are absorbed by the leadership of these tribes and then distributed along traditional lines in exchange for loyalty and service to others in Yemen. When I was in Aden earlier this year, the anger amongst the young people in Aden about their prospects in life was palpable, and the task I had at the time was to try to identify where we could place young Yemenis into larger businesses. But the answer was young southern Yemenis won't get placed into large businesses in Aden or elsewhere in the south, because those large businesses are all owned and run by northerners. And that's the result of, Yemen's biggest ever tribal raid, which occurred in 1994 and subsequently when state-owned land was taken by the tribesmen in the north, when property was taken from southerners and not yet returned, and passing one street where houses were full of bullet holes, I asked a young woman in the car with me, is this the sort of the sign of the Civil War in 1994? She said, no, that was 2 months ago. That's every year there's a big shooting here as the dispossessed families come back. They camp out on their old land. The government then sends the police in to move them off, and there's a shootout. And this has to occur each year in order for the family to have a visible land claim. Right? You've got to keep on looking after your property even though you're not holding it in order to someday hopefully make a claim for it back. It's this type of issue now in Yemen which is causing a great deal of fracture within a loosely held polity in any case. I will mention a bit more about that. So the police, the army, the ruling cliques and clusters of individuals in the north run the south as well. And the south is where the money is, that's where oil and gas is, and that's where 75% of all national revenue comes from. 85% of government expenditure is paid for by oil and gas. And the idea of the south splitting off from the north, as you might read about in the newspaper from time to time, is totally unthinkable for members of the government and any of the major tribes people in the north, because their wherewithal comes through this pipeline up to the government and out to them again. The method of dealing with the Yemeni government, therefore, is quite complex. For countries like Australia, one has to, any diplomatic representative of the country has got to spend a lot of time in understanding social dynamics. This man has his brother who is such and such, who is married to such and such. Knowing the family, the bloodline, the regional heritage and their commercial interests is essential to an analysis of a political situation. Totally unlike, really, the analysis which we might on a daily basis give superficially of the Australian government, where issues are out in the open, there's a lot of information around, people can make reasonable analyses, we're controlled and trammeled by our jobs and their definitions and our position in the bureaucracy and our responsibilities under law. All of those things are diluted in Yemen, and therefore the investment in analysis is much greater and more costly. Therefore, for example, you go to a good bookstore, of which there may be 2 or 3, and in Sana'a, books are not a big deal in the country. One of the most important books you can find if you're an analyst of the area is the genealogy book, the encyclopedia of who's who. Some of you might be in who's who in Australia, and it's not very big, but the Yemeni volume for 23 million people is big. It's four substantive volumes of descriptions of who's related to whom and for how long, because that's a very important thing for people to know. Yemen, therefore, is a country with a state that looks like a state. It's got names in it like a state. It has a Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Justice, a Social Fund, a Ministry of Defence. It has the trappings of a state, but those institutions are populated on a deal basis as well. I worked with the Ministry of Interior. It had 6 deputy ministers, 2 of whom might never have spoken to each other, even though functionally speaking they should have been quite well integrated on the basis of a feud. In one more laughable situation, 2 bureaucrats in the motor registry were feuding for a month. One of them had control of the drawer with the ink for the stamp, and the other had the stamp. One ran the stationery operation, the other one ran the front desk customer interface. No licenses issued for a month. Right? I'm not talking to you. You want more printer ink? Find it somewhere else. And that needs ministerial intervention to resolve, but it does play out for some time before it happens.